Imagine a world where authority isn't just about following the law, but about controlling and silencing those you think don't belong. Now, picture this. A police officer, convinced of his dominance, targets a woman in a courthouse, assuming she's just another ordinary person. What happens when he discovers, too late, that this woman is someone with the power to destroy his career and expose his deepest flaws? This is the shocking story of how one officer's mistake led to the unraveling of his life, and how a single moment of arrogance turned into a monumental fall from grace. Stay tuned, because the truth will explode in ways you never saw coming. Before we dive into this intense and eye-opening story, make sure to like this video if you want to see more shocking twists like this. Share it with anyone who needs to hear this jaw-dropping tale, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the truth hidden behind the headlines. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories. Let's get started. The confrontation. The courthouse, with its cold stone walls and marble floors, was silent in the early morning light. But in the mind of Officer David Langley, it was a battlefield. A battlefield that he believed was his to control, where his uniform and badge symbolized not just authority, but power over everyone around him. It's a quiet but intense place where every word, every action, and every look could set the stage for something more significant than anyone anticipated. David Langley had always prided himself on his 15 years of service. To him, his job was not just about enforcing the law, but keeping undesirables in check. It was a job that gave him a sense of pride, but one that had also blurred the line between right and wrong. His past encounters with the public had shaped his worldview. Anyone who didn't fit into his narrow understanding of law and order was, in his eyes, a potential threat. He didn't question it. He didn't have to. Today, he was stationed at the courthouse to provide security during a trial. A simple theft case, or so he thought. As he moved through the corridors of the Sullivan County Courthouse, his mind was more on his duty than anything else. The case, the defendant, it didn't matter. The people, however, did. He sized them up, judging their worth, their character. A harsh look or a tone of dismissive superiority was all it took to remind them of who was in charge. That was until his eyes fell on her. She wasn't flashy, but there was something about her. A woman, tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, walking confidently toward him. His eyes narrowed. This woman was not who he thought she was. She was just another face in the crowd, but something about her exuded authority, sophistication. It unsettled him. She walked toward him with calm assurance, as though she knew exactly where she was going. And that was exactly what irritated David the most. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice harsh, full of irritation. The woman paused, clearly caught off guard. Her response was simple. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bump into you." But David wasn't having it. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. "You people never know your place." She said nothing, but her gaze never wavered, as though she were silently challenging him. And that was the moment David made a decision he would soon regret. "I'm not letting you disrupt things here," he said, his arrogance now fully in charge. With a swipe of his hand, he ordered 2 officers nearby to remove her. "Take her out." There was no response from the woman, no cry of protest. She simply stood there, her eyes locking with his. It was unnerving, that calmness in her gaze, that sense of serenity that shook him in a way he couldn't explain. But David was too far gone, too entrenched in his own sense of power. The officers grabbed her, pulling her toward the door, and the tension in the hallway grew. People stopped to watch, some in disbelief, others whispering under their breath. For a moment, David felt satisfaction. He had restored order. But then, as the door closed behind her, she turned her head slightly, locking eyes with him one last time. And just for an instant, David felt a cold chill run down his spine. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the woman he had just thrown out was Dr. Emily Carter, a high-ranking government official, the Deputy Director of Federal Security. At first glance, Officer David Langley comes across as the embodiment of authority, confident, experienced, and seemingly invincible in his role. However, his blind prejudice and unchecked use of power create a toxic environment, not just for the individuals around him, but for himself as well. It's easy to imagine that someone in a position of power, like David, feels a certain entitlement. But what happens when that power is misused? David's treatment of Dr. Emily Carter is a glaring example of how deeply ingrained biases can skew judgment, especially when authority is seen as something that can be wielded recklessly. His words, his actions all stem from a dangerous assumption, that he is above reproach and that his perception of the world is the only valid one. What is truly terrifying is how quickly he dismissed the woman in front of him, seeing her as just another black person who didn't deserve respect. He failed to see her as an equal, as a professional, or as someone with the potential to destroy his entire career with a single statement. This clash of authority is not just a physical confrontation but an ideological one. It's a confrontation between entitlement and justice, between power and truth. For David, this moment was just another interaction to assert his control, but for Dr. Carter, it was the beginning of a much bigger confrontation. One that would have serious consequences for David, but also for the entire system that allowed him to behave this way unchecked. The reckoning begins. The moment the door slammed shut behind Dr. Emily Carter, David Langley couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at him. For all his authority and confidence, there was something about her that lingered in his mind. The cool calmness in her eyes, the way she had stood there, unwavering, her gaze steady and unflinching. It was as though nothing could touch her, as if she were on a different level altogether, and in that brief moment of connection, David felt the weight of his own arrogance. It was a feeling he quickly dismissed. After all, he was the one in charge. He had acted according to his position. He was a law enforcement officer, and people like her, people he perceived as outsiders, had no right to question his authority, let alone defy him in a public space. But the growing tension in the hallway was hard to ignore. The murmurs and stares from bystanders, the court officer's uneasy glances, made it clear that something wasn't quite right. David Langley had always been the type of person to believe in his own power, but now the cracks in his confidence began to show. A strange feeling began to seep in, the kind of feeling that comes with realizing that things are slipping out of your control, even when you're convinced they're not. Still, he chose to ignore the discomfort. After all, he had just done what he felt was necessary. His ego, his sense of entitlement, told him that it had been right, that his action was justified. He was only doing his job, right? But then Jonathan Pierce entered the scene. The civil rights lawyer. Jonathan Pierce, a prominent civil rights attorney with a history of challenging the police, stepped toward David with deliberate steps, his presence commanding the space around him. His eyes locked onto David's, and it wasn't just the weight of the confrontation between them. It was the unspoken knowledge that Pierce had been watching the entire exchange. He knew what had just transpired. And now, his voice cut through the tension, sharp and pointed. "Do you know what you've just done?" Pierce's words were calm but carried the weight of an impending storm. David turned toward Pierce, irritation creeping into his voice. "I did what I had to do. She didn't belong here," he replied, his arrogance still lacing his tone. But Pierce wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. His eyes narrowed, his voice dropping a degree colder. "That woman is Dr. Emily Carter, Deputy Director of Federal Security." David froze. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. Deputy Director of Federal Security. The woman he had so easily dismissed and thrown out of the courtroom was one of the most important and powerful officials in the country. A surge of panic washed over him. His body went cold, and his mind scrambled to process the gravity of his mistake. He had just ordered the removal of a high-ranking federal official. It wasn't just a violation of protocol, it was a violation of everything he thought he stood for. The full realization began to set in like a dark cloud hovering over him. As if on cue, Dr. Carter's voice rang out from the hallway. Her tone was calm but firm. "I need a task force here immediately." The words echoed in David's ears, but they didn't sink in. He stood there motionless, as everything he had believed in about his role, his authority, his invincibility, crumbled before him. It was too late now. The damage was done. The fallout begins. In the aftermath of Dr. Carter's forced removal, the courthouse atmosphere shifted drastically. The air became charged with unease. People began to murmur, pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding drama. The incident wasn't just a minor altercation. It was an abuse of power by a police officer against a government official. Word spread like wildfire, and soon enough, social media was ablaze with posts, videos, and hashtags. The public outcry grew louder, and the demands for accountability grew even stronger. David, caught in a whirlwind of regret and disbelief, stood frozen in place, unable to move or speak. His mind raced, but his body refused to respond. The crowd around him began to swell, their whispers growing louder, their judgments more pronounced. A few court officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared to speak out. They had seen what happened, but they weren't in a position to challenge him. Not yet. It was then that the Chief Justice of the court, a stern man who commanded respect, appeared in the hallway. His presence was as imposing as the courthouse itself, and when his voice rang out, it cut through the tension like a knife. "Officer Langley," the Chief Justice's voice boomed. "Report to my office immediately." David's heart sank. There was no escaping this now. The weight of his mistake was pressing down on him, suffocating him with each passing second. He tried to justify his actions in his mind. He was just doing his job, after all. But the words felt hollow. Nothing could erase the reality of what he had done. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. As David walked to the Chief Justice's office, his thoughts were a blur. He had always thought his uniform gave him power. He had always believed he could get away with anything because of who he was. But now, in the face of the consequences, he realized just how wrong he had been. His pride, which he had always held so dearly, was nothing but a facade. It had crumbled, and in its place stood the cold reality of what true authority meant. The Chief Justice and a few other court officials were waiting for him when he arrived. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and David felt every set of eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move. He knew this was the beginning of the end. Thoughts and analysis. David Langley's story is one of arrogance, entitlement, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what true authority is. For years, he had worn his uniform like a shield, using it to control and dominate those he deemed undeserving of respect. But what happens when someone who truly embodies authority, someone who has earned their position with integrity, challenges that mindset? Dr. Emily Carter's quiet, unwavering demeanor in the face of David's aggression was a stark contrast to his out-of-control sense of power. Her calmness wasn't a sign of submission. It was a sign of someone who knew their worth and knew that nothing could shake them. In this interaction, David learned an invaluable lesson. True power isn't about control over others. It's about self-control and the ability to understand when you've crossed a line. What's even more disturbing is that David had been warned. The civil rights lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, had tried to intervene, but David's arrogance blocked his capacity for self-awareness. In the end, David's mistake wasn't just a personal one. It was a reflection of a system that allowed his behavior to fester unchecked for far too long. This moment, when Dr. Carter's true identity is revealed, marks the beginning of a deeper reckoning not just for David, but for the entire system he represented. He had no idea what he had started, and soon the consequences would be impossible to ignore. The collapse of David Langley's world. As the door to the Chief Justice's office swung open, David Langley was consumed by the weight of the situation. The realization that he had just humiliated and removed a high-ranking federal official, Dr. Emily Carter, from the courthouse was now sinking in. The once arrogant confidence that had defined him for years was now replaced with a raw sense of vulnerability, a feeling he had never experienced in his career. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his way toward the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. He had always prided himself on being in control, never once questioning the authority that came with his badge. But now, with the reality of his mistake settling in, he realized just how fragile his position had always been. Inside the Chief Justice's office, the air was thick with tension. The room was filled with court officials and senior officers, all of them watching him with a mixture of concern and disappointment. As David entered, their eyes locked onto him, their collective gaze weighing on his shoulders like a ton of bricks. The humiliation was palpable, and for the first time in his life, David felt like a mere pawn in a game that was much bigger than him. The Chief Justice, an imposing figure, motioned for him to sit down. David's legs trembled as he slowly complied, the weight of the situation making it difficult to breathe. The words that came next were not just about his actions. They were about his entire career, his entire identity as a law enforcement officer. "We've received word from the Federal Security Office," the Chief Justice began, his voice cold and final. "Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done, Officer Langley?" David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was too much for him to process. He had always thought that his badge gave him the right to act with impunity, that his role as an officer made him untouchable. But now, the full weight of his actions was pressing down on him, and there was no escaping it. The fallout unfolds. Outside the Chief Justice's office, the courthouse had become a hotbed of activity. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon enough, the story of David's confrontation with Dr. Carter had gone viral. Witnesses had taken out their phones, capturing the entire incident, and within minutes, the footage was all over social media. The hashtags #JusticeForDr Carter and #AbuseOfPower trended for hours, and the public's response was swift and unforgiving. The courthouse, once a place of measured professionalism, now felt like a battlefield. The media had descended upon the scene, and the once respected officer, David Langley, was now the subject of widespread outrage. Videos of his outburst, his treatment of Dr. Carter, and the subsequent dragging of her from the courtroom were being shared by activists and concerned citizens alike. David's phone buzzed incessantly with messages and notifications, each one a reminder of just how fast the world around him was collapsing. A message from a colleague at the police department read, "David, we're getting calls from everywhere. The higher-ups are demanding action." Panic washed over him as he realized that this was no longer just about one isolated incident. His actions had sparked a nationwide conversation about police brutality, racial discrimination, and the abuse of power that plagued law enforcement. His career, his reputation, everything he had built for himself was slipping through his fingers. As the day went on, the pressure mounted. The police department had already been flooded with complaints, and the public outcry was deafening. David found himself more isolated than ever, his colleagues no longer looking him in the eye, their respect for him evaporating in the wake of his actions. The protection he had once enjoyed from those higher up in the department was gone, replaced by a chilling silence that spoke volumes. The disciplinary hearing. The next morning, David's world had completely shifted. His suspension was made public, and the media had picked up on it immediately. The press conferences, the protests, the calls for accountability, everything had become a blur of chaos. And in the midst of it all, David had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. The disciplinary hearing was set to take place at the police headquarters, and as David entered the room, he could feel the weight of every eye upon him. The room was packed with reporters, high-ranking officers, and civil rights advocates, all watching with bated breath as the board of senior officers prepared to discuss his fate. The hearing began, and the board wasted no time in presenting the evidence. Videos, witness testimonies, and a long history of complaints about David's behavior were laid out in front of him, each one a stark reminder of the unchecked power he had abused for so long. The footage of his interaction with Dr. Carter, the verbal assault, and the physical removal were all there for everyone to see. David sat in silence, his body stiff, his heart racing. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing was clear: there was no way out of this. He had crossed a line, and the evidence was undeniable. The disciplinary board was about to make it official. The final decision. After what felt like an eternity, the chairman of the disciplinary board spoke, his voice grave and unwavering. "Officer David Langley," he began, his words sharp and deliberate, "based on the evidence presented here today, we have concluded that you will be permanently dismissed from the police force. Your actions, including racial discrimination, abuse of authority, and the violation of official conduct, are unacceptable. The words hit David like a ton of bricks. He had imagined this moment, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all too real. He had built his entire life around the idea that his badge made him untouchable, that his actions, no matter how egregious, would always be justified. But now, in this moment, he realized just how wrong he had been. The chairman continued, but David could barely hear the rest. His mind was clouded with disbelief and shame. He had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and any semblance of respect he once commanded. The room fell into a heavy silence as an officer approached David with a small box. Without a word, the officer placed it in front of him. David understood what was happening. The box was a symbol of his fall from grace. His badge, his gun, his entire identity as an officer, all placed before him, ready to be taken away. With trembling hands, David removed his badge from his uniform and placed it in the box. His gun followed shortly after, a symbolic gesture of surrendering the very thing that had once made him feel powerful. The moment was over. It was final. The aftermath, a life unraveled. As David left the room, reporters swarmed around him, their cameras flashing in rapid succession. The questions came at him relentlessly, each one a sharp reminder of his fall from grace. "Do you regret your actions?" one reporter shouted. "How does it feel to be fired from the police force?" another asked. David didn't respond. His mind was too numb, his body too heavy with the weight of his loss. He knew that no matter what he said, it wouldn't matter. His reputation was destroyed, and the consequences of his actions were too severe to be undone. As he exited the police station for the last time, David paused outside, staring at the building that had once been his home. It was the end of an era defined by arrogance, power, and control. But now, standing before the building, he realized just how fragile that power had always been. His life had unraveled in a matter of days, and there was nothing left to hold on to. Dr. Emily Carter, the woman he had so easily dismissed, had shown him what true authority meant. She had shown him that power doesn't come from a badge or a uniform. True power comes from integrity, from respect, and from the ability to make tough decisions, even when they're unpopular. David Langley would never forget the price of his arrogance. The lessons he had learned were harsh and painful, but they were the truth. And now he would have to live with them for the rest of his life.